Before coming to Tunis, I lived in this city in the United States. It was called Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's a great city. It's a very working class city. The people there are hardworking and they're not pretentious at all. Almost everyone who grew up there lived in a modest house. Usually their fathers worked in a factory or a steel mill. In the 1970s and 80s, like many industrial cities around the world, it suffered a severe decline and it was riddled with urban blight. And Pittsburgh became like a poster child for the demise of the working class. So some years ago, an American politician decided to run for president, and he was a rich man who was from a famously wealthy family. And he was married to a woman who herself came from a different famously wealthy family. And when he announced his candidacy for president, he did it in Pittsburgh. And he said that he wanted to be the person who fixed, cities like Pittsburgh and brought back hope to the working class. That was sort of his message. Now, this particular candidate wasn't from that city. He wasn't particularly well known in that city, but he chose that city to make his inaugural speech as a candidate for president because it was a symbol of what he was all about. So he said. The first presentation needs to be carefully controlled. The very first appearance is going to communicate what you're all about. And more than any other appearance, it's going to convey your primary message. So, we see something like this in today's gospel reading about the wedding in Cana. Now, before we look at the wedding in Cana that comes in John chapter 2, I want us to remind ourselves of what precedes it in John chapter 1. So, first of all, John begins his book with this spectacular and dramatic fashion, what we call the prologue. It's opulent and it's epic. And, he starts with the words, "In the beginning was the Word," and it's a synopsis of all of creation. And also he tells us at the very beginning in that prologue, like the ending of the story. He gives us the end right away. And then after this amazing epic prologue, Jesus is introduced into the story, and he's introduced in this very theatrical way. In fact, when I read this first chapter of John, I'm reminded of one of those old Errol Flynn movies, where it starts out with some sort of prologue describing the situation, and then it cuts to a series of scenes with people who end up being not very significant to the story, and you start to set the tone of what's going to be happening, and as soon as there's a little bit of tension, then there's a new scene where the camera pans around and it stops on somebody's feet, and it slowly moves up as you see the whole figure of the man, the main character of the story, who's in some sort of pose that looks heroic, and the very first words that come out of his mouth are memorable. And that's kind of how it works in this first chapter of John as he's introducing Jesus. So at first, he's hinted at, Jesus is. And then John the Baptist sees him from afar. And he goes, there he is. That's all we know is this man there he is from afar. And then someone who would eventually become his disciples, they start to follow him and they start to chase after him. And then finally catching up to him, Jesus, for the very first time we see him in the book, he turns and he faces the camera and we finally hear his very first words, and he says, "Come and see." Come and see, come and see. Ultimately, it will become one of the themes of John's gospel. See, John's gospel, you can't read John's gospel without knowing that it's about essentially 7 signs. Each of these 7 signs is a miracle. And in the other Gospels, Jesus' miracles are sort of peppered throughout, But in the Gospel of John, these 7 signs, each one is a miracle, are there to demonstrate that he is the Messiah. And John's message is, look at these 7 signs. Come and see. Decide for yourself that Jesus is the Messiah. And, of course, that's how Jesus starts out. Come and see. And then, after this dramatic introduction, and hearing the very first words of Jesus, we're exposed to his first sign. The miracle at the wedding at Cana is the first sign in the Gospel of John. The first of Jesus' miracles. But more important than the fact that it's first, is that the first of these 7 signs tells us, that something is significant here. This is the first of the sign that I'm gonna describe. John describes the miracle at the wedding of Cana as his inaugural act, just like the politician who's announcing his candidacy. This is his inaugural act. The first appearance, it needs to be carefully controlled. The first appearance is going to communicate what you're all about. The first appearance is going to convey your primary message. So this idea of the first being important is true in general, but it's even more true in the Gospel of John, where John makes this big deal about beginnings and introductions. And so, the wedding of Cana, chapter 2, right after the great introduction, and we get the very first sign right away. This is Jesus' first miracle. It's his opening act. It's the inaugural sign conveying his primary message. And what is this inaugural sign? He makes sure the wine doesn't run out. Nobody's dying. Nobody's demon-possessed. Nobody's sick. Nobody's starving. The inaugural miracle of Jesus, which presumably says more about what he's come to do than any of the others, was to save a couple newlyweds and their families from embarrassment. Make sure the wine doesn't run out. So first, just let me say that this goes a long way towards convincing me that this story is a true eyewitness account and not just somebody making it up. Because this is not how it would go if you were making it up. If you were making it up, his first miracle, the inaugural act, would be like moving a mountain, to the other side of the river or something like this. No. Very first inaugural act, make sure the wine doesn't run out. So many people make a lot about how, the running out of wine was more than just an embarrassment, that it had to do with shame, and it could possibly result in the relationship between people breaking down, and maybe this wedding lasting, and all this kind of thing. And to be honest, I think that a lot of commentators make a little bit too much of this. Yeah, it would have been embarrassing. It would have been a problem, I'm sure. I don't know that that's necessarily where we need to go first with this story of the wedding in Cana. So we have to wrestle with this issue. Why is the quintessential signifier of what Jesus is all about to keep a party going? And I think the first sign is about more than just saving some families from shame. And I think it's about more than obeying your mother, which some people say that's really what's going on here. And I think this first sign, in some ways, it's more than just saving people from shame. It's more than obeying his mother. This first sign, it tells us, if we really look at it, what Jesus came to do. But not just that, it tells us how he came to do it. Let me show you what I see. First, what he came to do. So by keeping the party going, Jesus is telling the world that he is the master of the banquet. Now, in this story, which is only like 11 verses long, verses 8 through 10 are concerned with this person whose title is the master of the banquet. Like a third of this passage is about a guy who's called the master of the banquet. He plays a prominent role in this story. And so why is the first sign a miracle that the party keeps going? Jesus is saying, I am the true master of the banquet. I am the Lord of the feast. I come to bring festival joy. Now, he knows that he will need to suffer, and we know that in many times he will tell his followers that they also will experience suffering, but the end of the story is joy and festival blessing. And Jesus wants to start out with his inaugural act by saying, I am the master of the banquet. I bring festival joy. That's why this is my first sign. There is all kinds of language about feasting in the Bible. We see it everywhere, and sometimes we don't pay enough attention to it. Like in Psalm 34, taste and see that the Lord is good. Or in the book of 1 Peter, you have tasted that the Lord is good. We read places like Isaiah, the Lord Almighty will prepare feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. Isaiah's like being explicit there. This isn't just a metaphorical feast. This is going to be the best feast. In Luke, it says, but when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. The Bible is concerned with parties and feasts and banquets. And Jesus came to bring joy and festival blessing. And I think he wanted us to hear that first. And when I talk about joy and festival blessing, I'm not just speaking of the eschatological joy in the future, but there's this deep experiential joy right now also. Joy has these two components, and both are very real, and both are very good. One of them is this eschatological joy that will happen in the future. There's an amazing description of this in Dostoevsky. I'm going to read that. It's just phenomenal. It's about this end times joy, this ultimate joy that we'll experience in the end. Dostoevsky in the Brothers Karamazov says, I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, for all the blood that they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. I love this description from Dostoevsky of the ultimate joy, the eschatological joy. And it's true, and it's beautiful, and it's powerful. But it's not, there's this other side of joy, which is a current experiential joy. Maybe only a shadow of the joy in the future. And you know, we can't promise that faithful Christians experience it all the time. Sure, and some will experience it more than others. But God wants our lives to be a festival. He created us to enjoy Him and enjoy His creation and enjoy it now. So Jesus is saying, with his inaugural sign, I am the Lord of the feast. I come to bring joy and festival blessing. That's what he's come to do. But this great story of the wedding of Cana, it also tells us how he's going to do it. And there's this, in verse 6, there's this aside which just doesn't really belong there unless it's important. And it says, Jesus told some people to go get some water and put it in these jars. And it says, the jar's there for the Jewish rites of purification. He turned water into wine, but he did it in these jars that were reserved for the Jewish rites of purification. Now, the Old Testament system had a series of rules that were for approaching God. So it was clear that in some way, we were all flawed, right? There's need for some kind of cleansing. And the way that many of these rules were set up is that cleansing to deal with our flaws was done through sacrifices. And Jesus, in bringing this joy and festival blessing, he makes it clear that there's a new reality in this sacrificial system, this system that we use to cleanse ourselves of our flaws. He's come to replace the things of the Old Testament sacrificial systems, the tabernacle in the tower, the veil of the Holy of Holies, the blood sacrifices. And he's replacing these with a new way of bringing joy and festival blessing. Now, in this story, there's a very important interaction between Jesus and his mother. And he says to his mother, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? Our hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come." And, that seems a little bit rude. Woman, what does this have to do with me? And there's so much ink spilled over this topic, over this one word, woman. Many people, a lot of commentators will say, saying woman like this sounds rude to us, but it was even rude in the original Greek. And if you imagine what he was saying or how he was saying it in the Aramaic, it would have been rude also. And I don't know, I think that, again, maybe too much of this is made of this. I don't really think this is the case. Jesus actually refers to women, including his mother, other times with the same word in the same way. Jesus, while he's on the cross, is talking to his mother and says, "Woman, behold your son," referring to the disciple John. So I don't know that we need to make too much of the word woman and how that's used, but the whole sentence is very terse and very blunt. Whether or not calling his mother woman like this is rude, Jesus is very definitely challenging her. And he's actually, the words that he uses are like, "What does this have to do with me and you?" That's how it is, the translation literally. What does this have to do with me and you? And it is very blunt. It is very terse. So why would Jesus be curt and abrupt with his mother? I can't help but wonder if this whole experience, being at a wedding, was making Jesus think about his wedding. The festival that he came to bring is a wedding festival. We are the bride of Christ. It's not just a party, which would be good enough, but it's a party combined with intimacy, defined by love. That's a wedding. But here's the thing. Jesus knew that his wedding would involve immense suffering. Jesus was always thinking about his suffering. It was never very far from his mind. So I wonder, maybe this is why he was so abrupt. The thought of his own wedding was difficult. But in so doing, we get a glimpse of how he came to do this thing of bringing us festival joy. By replacing all the Old Testament rules about purification and getting it right with God, but it's involving suffering. So he's come to bring a party, to keep the party going. And in so doing, the sacrificial system which didn't really needed to be fulfilled, was being fulfilled, but it would require suffering. So this is the story of the wedding of Cana. And this story of the wedding of Cana is about so much more than Jesus just displaying his power. It's so much more than just about Jesus saving his friends from some embarrassment. Jesus' first miracle, the first sign in the Gospel of John, Jesus' inaugural act, is a microcosm of the atonement. This sign is Jesus choosing to suffer a little bit today in order to keep this party going. Because ultimately, what has Jesus come to do? But to fulfill and complete and replace the sacrificial system by suffering himself so that all mankind can feast at the great banquet in heaven and experience ultimate joy and festival blessing for all eternity. That's who he is. That's in his DNA, if you will. Why wouldn't you keep the party going? Jesus didn't just come to model something because he was a wise man and a good teacher. He came to bring something. And while other religions say, oh, okay, this is how you have to live in order to get to God, Jesus says, this is what I need to do in order to bring you to God. And so the first sign in the Gospel of John, Jesus' inaugural act, this thing that's more important than anything else, that tells us what he's come to do and how he's come to do it. It's Jesus' way of starting out his whole ministry by telling the world, I came to live the life that you should have lived, and to die the death that you should have died. And that is who we get to party with for eternity. Amen.